If you have ever put any money in a savings account, or if you've ever gotten paid any interest at all, you have violated God's commandment to not charge interest on debt. So why is it that virtually all Christians alive today completely ignore this command found all throughout the Bible? Well, I'll give you a hint. It's not because biblical interpretation changed, it's because the money changed. I'm Joe Brown and I run Heresy Financial, where I teach active investors how to decrease portfolio risk and increase returns. Before that, I was a stockbroker, but before that, what most people don't know is I went to Bible school to go into Christian ministry. And it's because of that unique combination of experience that I'll be able to identify for you today what the Bible is really commanding people not to do and how we can ethically and morally make more money in the process. To understand what's going on here, let's take a bit of a trip back in time about 5,000 years ago when money was gold. That's right, for about 5,000 years, maybe even longer, any time any historical document, including the Bible, talks about money, it's talking about gold and silver coins. For all of human history, up until 1971, all forms of money were either actual gold and silver coins or tied their value to gold and silver. This matters a lot because the supply of money that is digital, like the dollar, is controlled by a small entity of people who can just create more money with a few strokes of the keyboard. But for all of human history, it wasn't like that. If you wanted to get more money, there were only two ways you could get more money ethically or legally. Obviously, you could steal from somebody, but putting that aside, there are only two ways to get money. One is you give somebody else something that they want badly enough that they're willing to give you some of their money for that thing. Now that could be your time, that could be your labor, that could be a service, that could be a product. But in order to get money, you've got to come up with something that somebody else wants badly enough to pay you for it. That's the most common way to get money. The second way to get money was to go dig it out of the ground, because that's where gold comes from. Ultimately, you can just go dig it out of the ground. But when you think about the cost of what it would take to go find the gold to dig it out of the ground, then do the digging to get it out of the ground, and then melt it down to refine it to get all of the other stuff out of that gold so that you have something that you can actually purchase, you have to remember, well, it's got to be cheaper to do all of that work than to do any other work to get money. In other words, if I have to hire people and buy equipment and it costs me on average 2 ounces of gold, 2 gold coins, in order to produce 1 gold coin, then I'm going to be losing money on that venture. This naturally put a limitation on how fast the money supply could grow, because it could only grow if the demand for money was so high that it was affordable for people to spend the money to go get the gold, produce it, and put it into circulation. Otherwise, it was just more cost effective to do other work in order to get money that already existed. As a result of this, the average inflation rate over time was usually around 1%. And when I say inflation rate, I mean how fast the supply of gold increased over time. Now, a byproduct of a money supply that grows really slowly is that you have deflation. Now, we're all familiar today with the fact that the money supply grows rapidly, so you have more money chasing the same amount of goods and services, which means prices go up. We experienced that to extreme levels firsthand in 2020 and 2021 and 2022, when the money printing was in terms of trillions of dollars and the production of goods and services for a period of time actually dropped. So obviously in a time period like that, you're going to see the extreme inflation that will result. But for 100 years, we've had a money supply that grows faster than the supply of goods and services, and so overall we've had inflation during that time. For most of human history, it was the opposite, because you couldn't just print gold into existence. You could only get new gold if the demand for it outweighed the cost, which meant that the supply of goods and services always outpaced the increase in supply of money, which meant you had the same amount of money chasing more goods and services, which meant prices went down. In a system like this that existed for all of human history, let me remind you, you have savings that increase in value over time. If you have 1 ounce of gold today, that might be enough to buy you a horse. But in 50 years, that might be enough to buy you 2 horses. Without even doing anything, the value of your savings will grow over time. As technology improves, as the ability to produce houses and food and transportation all increase, you have more goods and services, more abundance of the stuff that people want and need, but the money supply stays roughly the same, it takes the same amount of money to get more stuff. In other words, again, stuff gets cheaper. So your savings grow in value, grow in purchasing power over time. You can see why in the Bible there's such an emphasis. If you've ever taken a look at all the things that the Bible says about money, there's a huge emphasis on saving. Today, savings get eaten away by inflation. But for most of history, you wanted to save because you would actually increase your purchasing power over time. It was safe to save. It was a good idea. It was financially literate. On the flip side, debt was the opposite. Debt got more expensive over time because debt means you owe money back. And if things get cheaper over time, it gets harder and harder to get your hands on the same amount of money to go pay it back. This year, I might be able to do 40 hours of labor to get the amount of money needed to pay off my debt. But in 5 years, it might take me 80 hours worth of labor to get the same amount of money because everything gets cheaper, including wages. So when the money supply is relatively constrained and can't grow rapidly, that means debt gets harder and harder to pay off over time. So if you've put 2 and 2 and 2 together now, you probably have already noticed that that means if you just keep your savings in a little pot, you keep your gold money away from, you keep it safe, it will increase in purchasing power over time. It's kind of like today, if you put your money in a bank, you get an interest rate on it, so that money pile will grow. If you keep your gold, the gold stays the same, like the gold doesn't have babies, like it doesn't grow, but it will grow in terms of its purchasing power. You'll be able to buy more stuff with it over time. But there is a risk because somebody can come and steal that money from you. Somebody could come and take it. And so for most of human history, if you wanted somebody else to store your money for you, a bank, you had to pay them for that. They had to have a strong building. They had to have security. They had to have the infrastructure in place to be able to make sure nobody stole the money from them because everybody knows they're the one that's storing all the money. So a safe place to put your money was a net cost. We also know that the borrower would get into a spot where it was pretty difficult to pay back that debt because debt naturally got harder and harder to pay off over time. In other words, if I loan my money to somebody and then they pay it back to me in a year or 2 years, with a 0% interest rate attached to that loan, I have actually put my money to work. I've kept it safe because I exchanged the money for debt and I've increased my purchasing power. So instead of having to pay somebody to store my money for me, I gave that money to somebody and said, okay, you owe that to me in a year or 2. No extra money, just the same amount of money. And now my purchasing power increases and I don't have to worry about somebody stealing it, which means if I charge them an interest rate, not only do they have the burden of paying back the debt, but they have a burden of paying back even more than they borrowed, which as purchasing power grows becomes even harder and harder and harder. This is why lending money was called usury, because it was very easy for people to get trapped in this cycle and never be able to pay off this debt. And charging any interest rate at all was considered unethical because you are already receiving a benefit by loaning your money out at 0%. Your money is now increasing in value for you just from natural deflation, and you don't have to pay somebody to store it for you. Your money's safe. It can't get stolen. So charging an interest rate on top of that was considered completely immoral. But something changed in modern times. As paper money was invented and as the proliferation of fractional reserve banking spread across the world and central banking set in and then ultimately digital money that they print into existence, the money supply increases faster than the supply of goods and services. Which is why today when you put your money in a bank, you don't have to pay them to store it for you. They pay you because they have to take your money. They go do something else with it to make money. So they pay you for the privilege of taking your money from you. And most of the time, it's not even enough to make up for the inflation, make up for the purchasing power you lost along the way. Which means that today, if you charge an interest rate on your debt that is equal to the rate of inflation, that is similar to in the past charging a 0% interest rate. You're not making any money at all. Now, it is impossible to determine what the real rate of inflation is because it's different for everybody. If you have a couple of kids and you live in a specific city and you have certain dietary needs, the rate of inflation in terms of how fast your cost of living is going up, it's gonna be very different from a single person who lives out in the country. Further than that, when things get more expensive, you naturally start buying other things that are less expensive, which means that those prices stop going up because now there's less demand for them. So it's not even actually possible to measure what the real rate of inflation is. And that's before you get into the fact that the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they completely manipulate what the real inflation readings are so that the official inflation numbers usually look lower than what the real inflation numbers would be, which is why today usury has been reinterpreted to mean really, really high interest rates. Like when you look at credit card rates that are 20%, a lot of people would say, okay, well, that's usury. Specifically making loans to people who are never going to be able to pay it back, specifically because the interest rate is so high, way, way higher than returns that you could get by investing in the stock market, by loaning out to the US government, way higher than the rate of inflation is for sure. And it's keeping people trapped as debt slaves. But in terms of the interest that you get paid in a cash account, like a money market fund in a brokerage account, or in a high yield savings account, those are almost always going to be right around the rate of inflation, which means it's basically the same thing as loaning money out for 0% back when the Bible was being written, which is why I'm a fan of, if you want better returns than zero on your savings, you actually invest. I am not a fan of lending money out, whether it's to corporations or the government or to people. I think being an investor has a higher ethical standing than being a lender, and also has better returns over the long term. Now, if you are in that same boat and you are an investor, you just don't know if you are invested properly. In other words, you're not sure if you have the right amount in stocks, the right amount in gold, the right amount in cash, the right amount in Bitcoin. You want to make sure that your portfolio is not susceptible to a crash, but also you have those good long-term returns. That's exactly what I help people do. And I'd love to help you out as well. I've got a course linked in the description below where I will help you do exactly that and bulletproof your portfolio. So go ahead and click there. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.